Today on BRStv Tank Trials ULM Edition, it's episode 2 and the beginning of everything with tank selection. And because they're so awesome, Red Sea has kindly offered to give away an E170 system with this week's episode, which is almost a $1,000 tank. I'm Ryan, your host of BRStv Tank Trials ULM Edition. Tank Trials is all about taking everything the BRS team and reefing community knows about a very specific approach to reefing, implementing that knowledge, tracking the progress, and exploring the results. This is week 2 of ULM and development of an ultra-low maintenance system. The goal is a stable, show caliber reef tank which requires as little maintenance as possible, potentially performing only a few minutes of maintenance a month. Today is all about tank selection. We're going to explore and select 3 different tanks and stands for this ULM project, 1 polyp and softy tank, 1 LPS and 1 SPS tank. That means we're going to develop some criteria for what ULM means in relation to tanks, discuss the available options, what the reefing community shared this week, and then make our selection. So how does ULM or maintenance relate to the tank selection? After some discussion with the team, I think there are some very obvious considerations related to tank size, shape of the tank, materials, tank design, and related stands. I'm going to start with tank size and stability. To me, stability is at the very core of a low maintenance system because it needs to be designed in a manner which has a buffer against equipment failure or unanticipated surprises. Things just have the potential to go south much faster in a 20-gallon tank than a 120-gallon tank. In fact, that 120-gallon tank essentially has 6 times the buffering capacity. I think it's also common for equipment or chemistry issues to be identified while performing daily, weekly, or monthly maintenance. So if we're going to be doing less maintenance, stability is even more important. That said, assuming that you're going to be there to witness equipment failures as they happen is a poor plan on any tank, and we're going to solve notification of equipment failures in other ways. Chemistry issues frequently develop slower, often over months, and having 6 times as long to identify the issue is very valuable. I think this is a good time to point out the goal of a ULM isn't to ignore or neglect the tank, quite the opposite. It's for the entire household to enjoy the tank more than ever because it doesn't have the same time constraints to succeed, and because of that, always looks healthy, clean, thriving, and generally awesome. I think everyone who loves reefing will still spend time with the tank every day, maybe even more. They just won't have their hands in the tank or hauling around as many buckets of water every weekend. So on that note, all things considered and relating to a system designed to be low maintenance, I think 40 gallons is about as low as I would recommend as stable for a softy and polyp or even LPS coral system. I think 60 gallons for an SPS tank. That doesn't mean that you can't go smaller. This is just a threshold where above this is likely to be easier to be more successful long term. The main reasons I recommend a larger tank for SPS is these types of corals deplete a wide range of elements much faster than other tank types, so additional water volume and stable chemistry is even more valuable, particularly as it relates to maintaining stable alkalinity. Not only do smaller tanks experience chemistry changes much faster because of the smaller water volume, but it's also very common for smaller tanks to have a much higher coral density than larger tanks, meaning more corals per gallon of water, so there's a compounding effect. So 40 and 60 gallons is about as small as I'd go. I think 120 gallons is about the tipping point where going larger is going to have diminishing returns in terms of stability, and reefers going larger than a 120 might have stability in mind, but most are almost certainly going bigger to achieve other tank desires. I'd also note that you can increase the size of the sump to increase water volume and stability, and that will be a component of our sump selection for sure. However, in contrast to larger tank sizes being more stable and selecting the right size tank for a ULM, in many cases larger tanks represent an opposing force in terms of the amount of maintenance required. Larger often means increased evaporation and top-off water to replace, larger water changes and buckets to haul around, more glass to clean, more sand to clean, skimmer fills faster, really all kinds of maintenance, not always, but often increases with the size of the tank. I think this is the reefer's paradox. Everyone knows that larger systems are more stable, and because of that, you'll likely be more successful. However, if we're being honest with ourselves, most reefers will also admit that an increase in demand on personal time spent on maintenance has a corresponding decrease in the likelihood that the tank will be successful, particularly in those periods of time where life is either very challenging or fun, and there are other significant demands on your time. I also think shape matters in relation to a ULM, starting with depth. I think tanks with a depth or height of more than 24 inches add a whole new dimension and visual appeal to the tank. fish start to noticeably explore up and down as well as front to back rather than just side to side, and in general, tanks that exceed 30 inches in height or depth are just cool. That said, almost no one's arms are long enough to reach the bottom past 30 inches, particularly in the back of the tank. It just makes maintenance significantly harder. So it's my opinion that 24 inches in height or depth is the maximum that I would select for a ULM system, just because going past that will increase the amount of time spent maintaining the tank. I also personally find oddball shapes and curves more difficult to clean and maintain with standard tools, so I might avoid those on a ULM as well. Related to that, the tank and materials, glass versus acrylic, have a direct impact on maintenance as well. Acrylic tanks can be clearer, provide more accurate color, less distortion, lower weight, and in many cases stronger, but there's no way around it. They scratch fairly easy, and you have to be more careful. So I'd say maintenance not only takes longer because you have to be more careful while cleaning the tank, but it's also more difficult, and you'll almost certainly have to spend some amount of time buffing out scratches now and then. So glass tanks are almost certainly a better choice from a ULM vantage point. Stands also matter. In general, taller stands are better because they provide more access to the equipment. I'd also look for something with a fairly wide door opening without support or decorative beams in between the doors. This will allow you to not just remove equipment for maintenance, but you can also often actually remove the entire sump if needed. Moving on to the specific tank designs and some of the most commonly available options. There are a lot of them nowadays, but I'm going to stick to 3 common tank selections with your standard glass tanks available at the fish store or big box pet store, the all-in-one type tanks like the innovative Marine Nuvo and the E-Series tanks from Red Sea, both of which have a smaller sump incorporated into the back, so there's limited equipment and no real plumbing requirements. Red Sea also has some solid tank packages as well. Between these options, I think we'll cover 80% of the popular choices in this tank size range. I think it'll be interesting to hear what the community thinks is the lowest maintenance, because I think you can make a case for each. In some ways, a plain glass box with no sump and very limited equipment might inherently be the lowest maintenance option because there's so few pieces of equipment to fail or maintain and no sump to clean. Once you add a sump into the design, it's just not more complex, but you also have overflows, plumbing return pumps, skimmers, detritus buildup, additional evaporation, and additional leak points, all of which need to be maintained. That said, most reefers will find it worth it for the cleaner looking tank, additional filtration opportunities, and larger water volume. The innovative Marine took a shot at providing a bit of the best of both worlds in an all-in-one solution, where the sump is incorporated into the back, which allows for a much simpler return solution with no real plumbing, very small return pumps, eliminates many potential leak points. Overall, just a lot easier to set up and likely somewhat easier to maintain as well, just based on the reduction of components and the total square feet that need to be cleaned and maintained. I think the most common is the smaller Nuvo 20, which can be a desktop tank, and the larger Nuvo 40, which probably applies more to what we're talking about today. Red Sea also has some common options, which can also represent a hybrid approach to all this. I think there's a lot of confusion between the models that they offer. There are basically 3 different approaches that they've taken to this, with the Red Sea Reefer, Red Sea Max E Series, and the Red Sea Max S Series. The Reefer series is more or less your standard rimless aquarium, but looks a lot nicer and designed for really engaged reefers who want to make a lot of personal decisions about the equipment that goes on the tank. So it doesn't include equipment like return pumps, flow pumps, or skimmers, and available with or without lighting. The tank is also designed with an internal overflow system inside the tank, so the tank can be positioned right next to the wall, and there's a fairly basic blank canvas sump, which allows for a lot of different equipment and does get a bit more complex with the XL larger models. This doesn't really have anything to do with the ULM, but I will say the look-through peninsula style is one of my personal favorite designs. End of story. I don't think the Reefer series is any more or less maintenance than your standard black trim tanks, just easier to set up and a lot nicer looking. Now looking at the Red Sea Max E series, this is a pretty interesting hybrid approach to all this, and I'm kind of on the fence on if it provides any potential reduction in maintenance. The Max E series comes with almost everything you need to set up a solid reef tank, meaning filtration, skimmer, power center, lighting, basically everything but a heater. The E-Series, however, is somewhat similar to the Nuvos in that they have that sump compartment in the back which holds all of the equipment. However, they also include a shield which hides the equipment and looks a lot cleaner, but probably the most profound difference is that E-Series comes with the ability to convert the plumbing so at a later date you can add a sump to the system if you wish. That can be done with just connecting some pipes and not a major hassle like converting other tank styles. Couple other notes: in its standard configuration, it uses 2 separate return or flow pumps, one on each side, which does mean additional maintenance on the pumps, but the redundancy of essentially having a backup return pump running means that it could be considered more stable. In the end, I do think there's some potential here to say these rear sump designs are certainly easier to set up and could be considered somewhat lower maintenance, but not enough to make a decision solely based on that factor. Moving on to the S series, this is for the reefer who really doesn't want to make a whole lot of decisions and just wants to buy a full-on reef tank with sump, power center, AI lighting, skimmer, and returns all in one. Again, the only absolutely required pieces of additional equipment is a heater, and many reefers might like to add some power heads. This is what I would call a plug-and-play system. You're going to pay for it, but all the decisions in DIY components are gone. The tank and stand are super clean looking, and I will say the one thing I very much like about this tank is how the overflow is not in the tank itself, so I don't have to see it or aquascape around it. The overflow is built into the flat back of the tank, and unlike other do-it-yourself designs that achieve the same thing, you can mount the tank flush to the wall for a clean look outside the tank as well. There's no visual plumbing coming out of the back of the tank. However, I don't think I'd call this any less or more maintenance than other options. And there's also those Marineland, Aqueon, and other high-volume tanks found at fish stores and big box pet stores. This is, of course, what a vast majority of reefers will end up using simply because they're a fraction of the price. Some of the fairly new rimless options are pretty nice for what you're spending. So outside of that, what did the community share specifically about tank selections and ULMs? Many came to some pretty similar conclusions, but with their own unique take on it. AquaArt said a good starting point for a ULM would be a 90-gallon glass aquarium, less than 26 inches tall, rimless, but with a cover to prevent jumpers. Why rimless? Because you can grab a cloth and clean the edge rather than dealing with the salt creep on its borders or Euro braces. The tank should be drilled with an overflow system that has at least one backup should something get clogged. The tank should be on a stand that's amply tall for viewing and equipment storage, but low enough where you don't need to pull out a step stool to reach inside. That's absolutely a solid take on this. Reef Pilot also suggested 80 to 120 gallons, large enough to make stability easier, but not too large, and not more than 24 inches deep. Donald Goldsworthy, 60-gallon cube with sump and refugium. Deem suggests we use something that 99% of the hobby uses, a basic 40-gallon breeder from Petco. It's essentially a great size to start with, small enough that it doesn't cost an arm and a leg to set up. Drill it for a basic overflow with a 20-gallon long or 40-gallon breeder sump. Splix believes that ULM also incorporates ULR, or ultra low risk. I think one of the best ULM tanks right now would be a Red Sea Max E260, no sump, no tinkering, nothing above and beyond what is necessary, large enough to be somewhat stable, and forces a customer to keep it simple. Pump, skimmer, carbon media, done. I Am Spartacus said, I think a standard 120-gallon tank would be a great size for a ULM. The water volume makes stability easier to obtain. It's not so deep or wide that reaching things in the tank is a pain. There'd be plenty of room underneath for automation equipment. It's great size to hold fish like rabbitfish and tangs that help with maintenance. It's still small enough that even if one had to do water changes from time to time, it's still pretty quick and easy. Andy G. 1960 said I'd use a popular Red Sea reefer series such as the 525 XL. This would get you a suitably sized tank with appropriate sump and the ability to add accessories of your choice. Leaf Whalen on YouTube said I think all-in-one tanks would be an excellent choice for this kind of test, since those that are getting that type of tank are also trying to get away from the hassle of even doing the initial setup. Overall, I think there were more requests for all-in-one tanks with sumps incorporated into the back, like the Nuvos and Red Sea E series, than anything else, and some solid debate as to if that truly represents lower maintenance, but these seem to be pretty popular tanks. Shaivu on YouTube, I think a 100-gallon would be best, with stable water, decent size, good looking, and with some automations. Carlson Moncrief had 2 comments. One, an ultra-low maintenance tank would be better at keeping your hands out of the tank. And 75 gallons is enough water volume for stability and enough to process the reef tank that most people would be happy with as a starting point. That comment about keeping your hands out of the tank has a lot of validity. Ultra-low maintenance can also increase stability simply because it promotes you to leave the system alone and keep your hands out, which almost always is the best thing you can do for a tank. Okay, so on to selecting actual tanks for this series, I'm going to select the smaller end of the discussed tank sizes because if we can achieve the results with the smallest end of our suggestions, then it should imply that the larger tanks will have even more success. I also have limited space in my office for 3 new tanks. I think this is a good time to point out that while ULM might be the goal for this series, every single one of us faces external factors that need to be considered. Available space, personal appeal, ease of setup, and budget will certainly play a role for a lot of reefers, and rightly so. After all is said and done, for both the Softies and Polyps tank as well as the LPS tank, I think the first option that I would personally be selecting between would be a 40-gallon breeder from the standard glass category. Partially because I find tanks that are deeper than they are tall tend to be solid dimensions for typical aquascapes and reef tanks, and frankly, they're cheap. A lot of us wait for Petco's $1 a gallon sale, which happens a couple times a year, and this tank is only 40 bucks. Only downside to a 40-gallon breeder is it's a 3-foot wide tank, which often means that lighting will be more expensive. So I'd also consider a 2-foot 60-gallon cube. While this tank is considerably more expensive, the fact that you can light it with a single light may mean the entire install is actually lower cost. On that note, I also consider the Nuvo 40 for Softies and Polyps or LPS tanks. These types of tanks are just less finicky about water quality and chemistry, which means you can get away with a smaller water volume and less filtration. As relates to the 3 Red Sea options, I'm just too nerdy and a self-admitted equipment junkie to select the S series that already has every piece of gear selected for me. I've been doing this a long time, enjoy the build process, and personally want more control over the system design and equipment selection, so that plug-and-play design just isn't for me. That said, I fully understand why this package design is an awesome choice for anyone who doesn't want to make all those individual choices and just wants something that works and capable of producing an awesome reef tank right out of the box. The Reefer 250 54-gallon tank is a solid option, looks clean, comes with a sump, but I think for a Softies and Polyp or LPS tank, I'd personally consider the E-Series 170 45-gallon or 260 69-gallon tanks. I honestly think it'd be possible for a lot of reefers with simple, low-demand tanks and careful feeding habits to get away with an AIO or all-in-one design with a back-mounted sump like this. And if you outgrow that, the fact that you can easily add a sump later makes it a pretty solid, flexible, future-proof option. Before I tell you what I selected from all that, let's look at 3 options for an SPS tank. In this case, I think a 60-gallon cube is a solid option. Since the SPS corals tend to grow upward, I think the 24-inch height is pretty valuable. Shorter than that, and there's some long-term growth challenges. If you want to go larger, the standard size tank at 90 is a good option, but a 120 seems to be the go-to standard, which seems to be the right blend of space and cost. In relation to the Red Sea options, with the ULM SPS tank, I know full well I'm going to have a sump, so I personally select one of the Red Sea Reefer options, which allows you the most flexibility to system design. So what do we select? Well, I'm sure the accounting staff here would have preferred that I select something that we actually sell. I selected 3 60-gallon Marineland cubes because I think that they're going to be the best option for this specific application. These are rimless 24-inch cube tanks in their Ventura-style stand, which looks nice, feels sturdy, and tall enough for my needs. I think 60 gallons is a decent enough size for a display, holds enough water to be stable in most cases, doesn't have a tremendous amount of glass or surfaces to clean, water changes are manageable, doesn't require a ton of equipment, and allows me to select my own low-maintenance overflow system, and will also allow me to select or design my own sump and filtration system to meet the goals of our ULM system. Also, like all of you, I have to factor into the equation what I personally like and what looks good in the room. In this case, I think 3 equally sized cubes with 3 completely different styles of tank are going to be a really cool addition to the room, look sharp, and a solid building block for us to start building our ULMs around. This is the part where you get to share your thoughts on what we ultimately selected, how you would have approached all this, as well as on next week's topic of selection of a sump for a ULM. This should be interesting because a lot of factors go into sump selection. This stand has inside dimensions of approximately 22.5 inches long by 22.5 inches wide by 29 inches high, with an area in the back which is open. So which sump would you select with ultra low maintenance being the main consideration? We need to select a sump design that fits our potential desired equipment, maybe filter media, skimmer, refugium, or algae scrubber. Are filter socks or a roller mat desired? Room for potential redundancies, ideally easy to clean. Potentially a dosing area that eliminates precipitation, sponges, baffle design, anything that could impact how easy it is to clean and operate the tank with as few touches as possible. So share your thoughts with the YouTube community down below, or check out our ongoing ULM build thread over on Reef to Reef with the link down below. And if you want to win that Red Sea tank, click the link that just showed up, or head on over to the site, click on the Sales and Deals tab, and then free stuff. Again, big thank you to Red Sea for being so generous to the reefing community. As always, if you find this kind of thing fun or interesting, let us know with a quick thumbs up and subscribe, because we release new reefing videos all week long. See you next Friday with the next episode of BRS Tank Trials ULM Edition.